So my overall take on The Female Brain, as a romantic comedy, I think it succeeds. I think it's very funny and surprisingly heartfelt at times. As far as an educational movie, delving into the science behind gender differences, it does an okay job. Pairing a scientific term like cortisol or amygdala with the more commonly used term we use in popular culture like neat freak, micromanaging, it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't go much more in depth than that. A couple times the movie gives a very broad overview of some evolutionary psychology arguments, and this is where I think the film's at its weakest, because the film, it does seem to want to break down some gender stereotypes, kind of put a different spin on them, and I think that in this respect, the film often fails. So one example of the evolutionary psychology, they say, look, in prehistoric times, women's survival depended more on social bonds than men's survival. Men's survival depended more on aggression and strength. Therefore, women prioritize social bonds. Gossip promotes social bonds. Therefore, women in current times gossip and read tabloid magazines. Now, I think a lot of evolutionary psychology is valid, but that example in particular and a few others, I think you're making some connections and jumps that aren't there. However, I do agree with the central message of the movie, which is you had a female researcher researching gender differences. She kept getting results that seemed opposed to her ideology, so she kept changing and tweaking things, trying to find a bias. And when she realized actually the bias was how she was interpreting the results, and she says, look, if you get a scientific result that says women are more cooperative, more adverse to conflict, you can look at that as, well, then women are going to be worse leaders because they're not going to take risks, they're not going to be as assertive. Or you can look at it as, say, women in a lot of circumstances could be better leaders because good leadership is cooperation rather than just bullying all your subordinates into following your lead. And I think this is true. People often think of science as very objective. They don't realize how much interpretation really goes into interpreting the results that we get out of these experiments. One great example, so it was found that conservatives have overactive amygdalas relative to liberals. And all the articles that were written about that said, well, look, conservatives are more fearful, they're more primitive, they hate the other, this explains their racism. But then it was found that women have more overactive amygdalas relative to men. And now all the articles that were written talked about women being more attuned to threats and more vigilant, and just the way that these results were interpreted, very different depending on the political bias of the people looking at the results. I really did like how they talked about epigenetics and how when a woman's pregnant and she's stressed, those stress hormones, they can create changes in how the genetics are expressed. So this is a way where it's different than nurture, it's different than parenting, it's different than nature, it's different than genetics. This is a third thing where the actual environment that a woman is in when she's giving birth, when she's pregnant, that can change how the underlying genetics are expressed. And I think that that's a really cool thing. But moving away from the science and just looking at the movie as a traditional rom-com, again, I think it did a lot of things well. I think that the relationship between Whitney Cummings and Toby Kebbell, I thought it was very sweet. And again, you can nitpick and say it seems to imply that all driven, career, passionate women, well, really, they're just brokenhearted and they're just scared of love, and that's why they're burying their nose in their career. So again, the gender analysis, I don't know if you can say it's progressive, but I do think it was very sweet as far as a traditional kind of throwback rom-com. They had a great relationship. And Beanie Feldstein as the friend, that's the only role I've seen her play, but she does it so well. She was great in Lady Bird. She's actually Jonah Hill's sister. She was terrific, as always. Blake Griffin was a surprise standout in this. Some really great comedic timing, channeling his inner Channing Tatum a bit, but like I say, maybe with even better comedic timing. So I was really surprised by him. He did better than LeBron in Trainwreck. LeBron did great, but he did even better. And then Sofía Vergara and Deon Cole. Now, I love Deon Cole. He's my favorite character from Blackish. I thought he was hilarious. I thought they did a great job. They had, in some ways, the most boring storyline, just traditional older couple losing their spark, and I thought they were such charismatic, dynamic performances. They really carried the storyline and never made it feel boring. And actually, I thought this was a storyline where they kind of snuck in some ways, the most radical, progressive message that, look, divorce doesn't have to be this negative, horrible thing that makes you feel like failures and makes the kids really traumatized. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. So some couples, if we look at the fact that, look, after enough time, dopamine's going to stop flowing and you're going to lose that spark. What are we going to do with that? And one explanation is, well, you keep trying new things to spice it up. You pretend you're strangers and you role play and do all this. Or you could say, look, you could say that having a marriage that lasts 12 years and then ends, that's not a failure, that's a success, that's lasting longer than so many other marriages, that's lasting a long time, that's having a lot of good memories. So if we change the way we look at divorce and view it less as a failure and more as just kind of a natural part of life, maybe it'll not be so stigmatized and not have such a traumatic effect on all people involved. And then the James Marsden and Lucy Punch storyline, in some ways this was the weakest, but Lucy Punch, she was in Bad Teacher, she was Amy Squirrel, I'll always love her for that, and I'm a big fan of James Marsden. He did a hilarious British accent, and it's just funny because he's actually quite good at accents. I'll post a clip of him doing a Matthew McConaughey that's really funny. And I don't know what it is, but he reminds me so much of Tom Cruise. I don't know if anyone else gets that vibe. So bottom line, I think how much you enjoy this movie, it's going to be your expectations going in. If you're expecting some kind of radical, new kind of movie that breaks down all the ways we look at gender, it's not that. It's in some ways very old-fashioned, very stereotypical, but I think that if you want a lighthearted, very funny rom-com, you'll be surprised at how much you like it. And Whitney Cummings, who stars and directs, she's a creator of Two Broke Girls, so that should give you an idea of just what kind of movie you can really expect here.